Welcome to State of Mind. Being human and living well.
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 I'm Deborah Sloss, producer and host, and licensed marriage and family therapist. My pronouns are she, her. Each year, more than 74,000 parents in the United States face the unthinkable, the death of a child. In the U.S., approximately 37,000 children die before their 18th birthday, according to the National Center for Fatality Review and Prevention. For children ages 1 to 12, the three leading causes of death in order are unintentional injuries, including firearms and other accidents, followed by cancer and homicide at much lower rates. For adolescents ages 12 to 17, the leading causes of death are also unintentional injuries, with suicide and homicide close behind. With each of these losses comes the loss of hopes and dreams a parent holds for their son or daughter. And yet, life goes on, somehow. This is what we'll be talking about today. How does life go on after this unimaginable loss? What can help parents continue living in the aftermath of profound grief? Before we begin this interview, I want to advise listeners that today's episode includes discussions of the tragic deaths of teens and adult children and may not be appropriate for all audiences. Today's program is a remix of an interview originally recorded in 2023, and its message remains as important now as ever. Joining us in this conversation are writer and director Colin Campbell and psychotherapist and grief specialist Kara Bowman. At the time of this interview, Colin Campbell was a writer and director for theater, film, an Academy Award winner nominee, and a professor teaching theater and film at Chapman University and Cal Poly Pomona University. After his two teenage children, Ruby and Hart, were killed by a drunk driver in 2019, Colin fell into a terrifying chasm of grief and hopelessness. Drawing strength from the mourning rituals of his wife's Jewish traditions, he learned to lean into the pain of grief. His book, Finding the Words, explores his journey through profound loss and offers hope to others navigating similar terrain. Also with us for this interview is Kara Bowman, a marriage and family therapist specializing in grief and trauma. She held advanced certifications in grief counseling, trauma therapy, communication, and thanatology, the study of death and dying. Kara is the author of Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss, and also volunteered with Hospice of Santa Cruz County, where she also trained and educated others on grief and trauma. She has devoted her work to supporting individuals and families in pain and has been a guest on several State of Mind episodes in the past. We're so glad she joined us again for this conversation. Welcome to State of Mind, Colin and Kara.
Well, thank you, Deborah. Thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm so glad you're talking about this important topic.
Well, Kara, I want to begin with you. I've heard so many people say that they just can't even imagine how they could go on or survive after the loss of their child. And yet so many people do have to face that profound loss. So can you talk some about what makes the grief of losing a child or children an entirely unique kind of grief? And how does that differ depending on the age of the child?
Yes, it is a grief that is different than any other grief. And that's because a child is part of us in a way that no other human being is part of us. We can feel very alone and very different because it's not an expected death. It's called an out of order death. It feels wrong. These days, we don't expect any children to die. So any child who dies, it feels very, very wrong. There are differences in different ages. Half of children who die under 18 die in the first year of life. Perinatal and stillbirth deaths are often considered disenfranchised. And a disenfranchised death is one that's not really understood or recognized by society. So a lot of people think that those deaths would somehow be easier because you didn't get to know your child. But you've still lost all of your hopes, your dreams that you had invested in that child. And you've still lost your role as a parent and your identity as a parent. And then with a child that's under 18, guilt can be a very large factor because one of our greatest roles is that of protector and that of fixer. And we can't fix death. And we feel that we have failed in our job of protecting them, even when it has nothing to do with us whatsoever.
And it seemed like you were indicating that in maybe generations past, more people had the experience of losing a child than now. Do you feel there was a greater understanding of that loss then than now, or did it just go unspoken?
Absolutely. Historically, up until around a couple hundred years ago, in all cultures, around 50% of children died before age 18. And between 40 and 60% in different time periods, different cultures. And so people were very, very familiar with children dying. Now in the United States, about 0.8%, less than 1%, die before reaching age 15, and half of those die before age 1. In the world, that's about 4%. So it's very unfamiliar now, and death in general is very hidden. People don't talk about it. People hide it. It's not public. Colin, one of the things I appreciate so much about your book, but also how you grieved, is you have chosen to grieve publicly. And I think that is not just a benefit to you, it's a benefit to everyone around you, and it's a benefit to the world and to our society. I think we need many more people who are brave enough to grieve publicly. It helps people understand how others have gotten through it. It helps destigmatize it. It helps people not feel like they've done something wrong, or there's something different or special about them. By age 60, 9% of Americans will have experienced the death of a child. And by age 80, 18% of parents in America will have experienced the death of a child. And that's actually higher for Black families and Hispanic families, and lower for white families.
Colin Campbell is also here with us today, as Kara referenced, to talk with us about losing both of his teenage children in a car crash caused by a drunk driver, how he and his wife survived, and how he's been finding his way back to life. Can you tell us about what happened that horrible day that both your children, Ruby and Hart, died, Colin?
Yeah. We were, all four of us, my wife Gail and I and Ruby and Hart, were driving to Joshua Tree from Los Angeles. And Joshua Tree is a small town in the high desert, about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles. And we were actually going there because we had just spontaneously, on a whim, we had purchased a little summer, sort of a vacation home out there. We didn't think we could, and suddenly we fell in love with this place, and all four of us were so excited about it. And that night we were going on June 12th, we were going back there to look at this place we had just bought. And in many ways, it was sort of a high point in our lives as a family. Ruby was struggling with OCD and depression and suicidality, and she had just found the right combination of drugs and therapists. And so she was getting a new lease on life. And the four of us loved hiking in Joshua Tree. It's a beautiful place. So we were all very high spirits, very excited when a drunk driver crashed into our car, going 90 miles an hour. And Ruby and Hart were in the back seat, seat belts on, but that doesn't help you when you're T-boned, unfortunately. So the force of impact killed them both in the back seat.
God, I can only imagine what kinds of emotions you and your wife were experiencing in those first days after their deaths and in the weeks that followed. Can you talk some about that?
Yeah. There's a lot of disbelief. I think a lot of people say, I can't believe they're gone, and they mean it literally. It just really was unbelievable. We could not believe that this was reality, and that's very disturbing to be in that place of just such shock. And then there was fear. That was also something that was unexpected. I didn't realize how scary acute loss is. And so we were terrified. We were terrified to be in our own home without Ruby and Hart. It seemed so scary, so lonely and scary. And falling asleep was scary. The terrible nightmares that came were scary. And we were also, there was a point early on in our grief where we were scared if Gail and I couldn't see each other. We suddenly got panicked. Is Gail dead? Is Colin dead? So we had this we called it proof of life. So if one of us had to go on an errand or something, we would text and say, I'm coming home. I'm still here. Because it was so scary. Because the idea that Ruby and Hart was suddenly gone from this earth meant, subconsciously that anybody could be killed at any time. It felt that way. It felt so vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah, I have, in my own experience as a therapist, have seen people also feel so adrift, so lost, and that's also really terrifying for them, where they don't feel any footing in their current life.
Yeah, that I called it being untethered. I felt untethered to life because my sense of meaning and purpose was gone. My whole identity was wrapped around being Ruby and Hart's dad, and when that was gone, taken from me, I didn't know who I was, and I didn't really see the point in being alive without them.
How would you describe the state of your mental health after the car crash and the death of both your children?
Well, there was an awful lot of despair alongside all this other things I'm talking about, the idea of being untethered and having no meaning and purpose. And that despair is a very scary place to be, where it didn't feel like it mattered if I was alive or not. So I wasn't suicidal. I had no active plans to end my life, but I didn't really feel attached to living. It didn't seem like there was a reason to be alive. So my mental health was sort of unattached to life. But and that was scary. That was scary to feel that, and very alone too. Before Ruby and Hart were killed, I had lots of friends and family that I loved very much and that mattered very much to me, including my wife, right? But once they were killed, suddenly nobody else mattered. In acute grief, it felt like nobody else mattered to me but Ruby and Hart, because they were gone forever. I think that's fairly common for people in acute early grief to feel that way. And so as a result, I felt terribly lonely. Even though I was surrounded by friends and family who loved me and were supporting me and my wife, I felt so lonely.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. I just want to turn to Kara and say, how much of what Colin and his wife were experiencing is similar to what you've seen in the bereaved parents you've worked with?
Yes, everything he said is very understandable, very, very common. Let me just start with the disbelief. The disbelief happens because our brains are not like computers, and there's not a switch saying somebody is there and somebody is gone. That happens all of a sudden. It turns all of a sudden. People are integrated all throughout our brain, and we rewire our brain through iteration, through thinking over and over again. Oh, they're not there in that context. Oh, they're not going to be there in the future in that way. Oh, they're not there to have dinner with me tonight. And we have to think the same thought over and over and over again in order to rewire our brains. So it's a process that takes time. It's an adjustment. When there's actual neurobiology involved, there's stress hormones that increase, and there's dopamine and oxytocin, which actually motivate us to find somebody who's missing. They're kind of the hormones that make us want. And then over time, there are neural transcription changes that happen in the brain as we try to understand what happens and make sense of it. We make meaning out of things. And then the brain changes and updates. And that's a mechanical process that takes time.
The idea that our brain needs to go over and over this new reality in order to understand it, I really felt that viscerally. And I sort of discovered that in my grieving process, the need to talk about my grief and Ruby and Hart and the fact that they were gone over and over again, it just to combat that denial and just really understand it, to really process that this new reality. The idea that it just takes a lot of talking about it, which I think is so important, because I think a lot of people imagine that people in grief don't need to talk about it, don't want to talk about it, and should be left alone. But actually, to your point, we need to talk about it a lot just to get it, just to understand what's real.
So, Colin, you and your wife not only survived the loss of both your children. In your book, you say that you found your way back to life. In mental health, we often call that recovery. That's not to say that anyone ever recovers from the loss of their children, but you both are in a process of recovery by being able to get back into living your lives. So can you talk some about what were the important elements that helped you make it through the hardest times and on to this recovery process?
Yeah, I think one of the strongest things that helped us was a sense of community, of people being there for us. I'm not Jewish, but my wife is Jewish, and we raised Ruby and Hart as Jews. They were bar and bat mitzvah, and we were active members of our temple. We are active members of our temple. And we, as a family, really leaned on the Jewish traditions of mourning. And they were an eye-opener for me personally. They really taught me literally how to grieve the deaths of my children. And one of the earliest lessons was Shiva. So for those of you who don't know, Shiva is 7 nights after the funeral. People come to your house each night and sit with you, hence sitting Shiva. And each of those nights, our wise rabbi would turn to us and say, after some prayers were said, she said to us, do you want to say anything to the people here? And it turned out we did. We really did want to talk to them. And we talked to them about Ruby and Hart and about our grief. We told stories, and we encouraged them to talk as well. And they did. So all of Ruby and Hart's friends came up in front of the whole gathering crowd and talked about Ruby and Hart. And we laughed and we cried together. And it taught me very early on that was so helpful in my grief, to not be alone, but actually to be talking about it with the community. And so I developed this, what I call a grief spiel, because after Shiva ended, then the structure was gone and people didn't really know how to talk to me. So they were scared to talk to Gail and I. They were scared to say the wrong thing or to accidentally upset us. Even simple like, hi, how are you? They wouldn't say it because they were scared. How am I? How do you think I am? I might rip into them with rage. And they wouldn't say Ruby. Some of them wouldn't say Ruby and Hart's names because they were scared. They were scared that it would hurt me to hear the names of my children. And so my grief spiel was, I'd pull each person aside individually and tell them, here's the deal. I need to talk about Ruby and Hart. I need to hear their names, and I need to talk about my grief. And I can talk about something else for a couple of minutes, but then I got to circle back to my grief because it's so huge right now. I don't have the bandwidth to talk about politics or the weather right now. And all my friends were very grateful for that because they wanted to help me, but didn't really know how. And that helped me in turn because I was like, oh, this is helpful to them, helpful to me. I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep talking about my needs, sharing my needs with my community so they can be there for me in a more real way. And that was so helpful.
Another thing I think that you mentioned when I talked to you about coming on the show was not shying away from the pain. Can you talk some about that?
Yeah. So grieving hurts. It hurts. The pain, aching hurts. Early on, it's healthy. It's not a a neurosis. It's not some kind of mental health problem. It's a sign of mental health to grieve. And I had this sort of epiphany very early on. It was like 2 days after the funeral. I had big blown up photos of Ruby and Hart, and I 3x2 foot photos of them, and I taped them to the walls of my living room. So I had 8 photographs, big photographs of them, all in the living room, just so I could see their faces. It just helped Gail and I to see them. And then one morning I looked away from them because it hurt so much. It hurt so badly. And in that moment, I had this epiphany of like, I'm not going to turn away from my children because I'm too scared of the pain. I'm not going to let the pain get in the way of me loving my children, because that's what it felt like to me. If I'm turning away from their photographs, if I'm not even going to look at them, in a way, it felt like I was allowing the pain to get in the way of my love. Because to me, it felt like you couldn't have one without the other. If I can't think about Ruby and Hart because I'm scared of the pain, then I'm missing out on all the love we shared. I'm sort of living in denial in a way, where I'm trying to compartmentalize or box up my emotions. And so I found that if, in fact, leaning into the pain, it actually helped me. It actually ultimately hurt less. Sort of the healthy pain of grief is there, but there's also the unhealthy pain of all the things we do when we don't deal with our emotions, all the sort of suffering that can cause us. And I think ultimately that outweighs the pain of healthy grief if you're trying to avoid your grief.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today, we're discussing the profound grief parents experience after the loss of a child and how it is possible to pick up the pieces of your life and go on living. Joining us for this conversation is father and writer Colin Campbell, who lost both of his teenage children in a car crash caused by a drunk driver in 2019. Also with us is psychotherapist, grief specialist, and writer Kara Bowman. Listeners of today's show may also want to check out episode 80, titled Suicide Loss, Living with the Pain and Learning to Heal, where a mother shares her story of mental health recovery following the suicide death of her adult son. That and many other episodes can be found in our archives at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Now, let's get back to our interview. Colin, you sort of mentioned this earlier, that you yourself had some common misunderstandings about grief and grieving. And I'm wondering what some of the misunderstandings about grieving that you ran into in your own grieving process. And these could be either like systemic misconceptions or misunderstandings occurring between you and with other people in your personal relationships.
Yeah, I think I really had this idea that that you grieve alone, that something terrible happens and you go off in a corner all by yourself until you're kind of fixed, and then you come back and join society when you're ready. I think I kind of felt that that's how it worked, and I learned very quickly that was not going to work for me. That I needed my community. I needed to talk about Ruby and Hart to other people, just so I could understand it, just literally help me understand it, and make it feel real. And I had to keep doing it in each new situation in my life. So I had to, in a way, introduce grief into all my relationships, because I was this grieving person. And so my relationships with everybody changed. So a lot of my friends were friends of mine because Ruby and Hart were friends with their kids. And so we had sleepovers together, and we shared holidays together. And now suddenly Ruby and Hart are not there, and their kids are still there. And it's a new relationship that has to be negotiated, because now when I go over to their house, there's this element of grief that comes with, right? This loss. We're all missing Ruby and Hart. And so I had to sort of keep doing that over and over again, sort of redefining or creating these relationships, each individual relationship. And that was a difficult but interesting journey to go on.
Kara, what have you found to be some of the most common misunderstandings about grief, especially the profound grief of losing a child at any age?
Well, that there's an end, that grief is a process with a beginning, middle, and end. It's actually a change in who you are, and that change is permanent. It's an integration, and it's not something that ever ends. You will be grieving as long as you live. Now, the grief will change, and it will become less sharp and more melancholy, but it will never go away.
What are some of the systemic or personal barriers that could make grieving and recovering from the loss of a child even more difficult? And if you find yourself in that situation, then what?
Well, maybe this is a good time for me to talk about when to get professional help, when it may not be enough to grieve on your own. There's actually a list in research of 53, I think, different factors that can impede grief and cause a need for professional help. But we haven't talked too much about trauma, but trauma is very, very common when losing a child, because 80% of deaths of children under 18 are trauma related. Let me see, 48% are accidents, 18% are suicide, and 16% are homicide. 8% are cancer, and then birth defects, heart disease, and other illnesses. So trauma is very common. And when there's trauma, that doesn't necessarily mean you need professional help, but you'll have probably things like flashbacks and overwhelming emotion, and want to avoid thinking about certain things, or avoid certain reminders. And if that goes on for a period of 2 or 3 months, then that gets into what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And there are different ways of treating that than are used to handle normal grief. And so you need to go to a trauma professional if you find intrusive things such as flashbacks or nightmares, or if you find avoidance happening over a period that doesn't wane. So that's one reason you might need professional help. Another is if grief morphs into depression. And grief and depression are not the same thing. And I'll give you a quickie little quiz that can help you tease out the difference. This is not a diagnosis, but it just leads you to think you might want to look into professional help. One difference is self-esteem. With grief, self-esteem stays steady, and with depression, self-esteem nosedives. With grief, mood goes up and down. You can have moments of laughing and moments of feeling okay. And with depression, mood is pretty constantly low. And with grief, there's some hope that someday you'll feel better. And with depression, there's a hopelessness. You feel like you'll never feel better. So if you think that your grief has changed into depression, you want to get help. That won't necessarily get better on its own. Another reason is suicidality. It's very, very, very normal to just feel like you don't want to be here. And so that's not a reason to get professional help. That's pretty much more common than not in losing a child. But if it's anything beyond that, if you think, I'd really rather be dead, and you're making plans and you're thinking, I wonder how I could make that happen, and I'd rather be with them. If you're having those kinds of thoughts, anything beyond, living is hard, I don't really want to be here, anything beyond that, then you want to get help.
And when you're talking about seeking professional support, can you just list some of the places someone might find that?
Sure. So you can go to Psychology Today and find a list of social workers or therapists, and they will list what kind of insurance they take. You can go to your insurance provider and find a list of therapists. You can go to hospice. They no longer do individual counseling for people who haven't lost somebody who's on hospice services, but they do group counseling. So if you're interested in group counseling, you can go to hospice. If you have low funds, you can go to family services. And then you can also go to Compassionate Friends, which has a group for people who have lost children. And there are also some online resources that will be in the resource list online.
People also sometimes turn to their primary care physician as a starting point to talk about what's going on, and that can lead to further resources for them. Sometimes people will go to their clergy, and that some clergy are able to provide very skillful counseling. Some are trained as counselors and can provide some kind of support. Many churches and religious communities will have support groups sometimes for people who are struggling after the loss of something like that, or even for mental health. I've seen some groups provide ongoing mental health support groups. Just some other ideas, because not all our listeners are in the Santa Cruz and Monterey area. We do have listeners around the country. So, and some of the agencies that Kara mentions also might have local chapters in your area. So take a look at our resource list and also become familiar with those in your own community. We're taking a break from our interview to share with you another parent's story. While losing a child by any means is catastrophic, there can be circumstances around the death that add additional complications to the grieving process and can impair the kinds of support parents receive from their communities. We'll next hear from Christy about how she's finding her way following her son Forrest's death by overdose.
I am the mother of 3 children, and today I'm speaking to you of my forever 29-year-old son, lost to us by chronic back pain, depression, anxiety, and subsequent drug addiction. Forrest was a joyful child full of adventure and curiosity. Spiders, skateboarding, downhill mountain bike riding, painting, scuba diving, so much more. 5 years before his death, he had a moped accident. Back x-rays showed a lifetime of chronic back issues. Already prone to anxiety, he was confused and deeply troubled as to what his life path would now be. His goal was to continue his diving career, yet now the thought of putting on heavy equipment was out of the question. He turned to kratom, an herbal substance that produces opiate-like effects and helps alleviate pain, anxiety, and depression. He wanted to stay away from pharmaceutical pain meds. After 2 years of ever-present mental and physical pain, he turned to harder drugs. Heroin stole his life. He died on November 30th, 2021, of an accidental overdose. There is so much to say about Forrest and what it's like to lose your child. 18 months later, where I am right now on this tragic journey is where I'll begin. After a recent road trip through the Southwest and Eastern Sierra, nature and hiking have always been where I find my deepest peace. For the first 3 weeks, I cried throughout each day, talking to Forrest as I hiked and biked. I'd start each morning filling my journal with letters to him. Between tears, letters, and stunning mountain and desert scapes, my grief started metamorphosing. I feel ready to have a new relationship with Forrest. I still talk with him on my daily walks, yet free of the heaviness that accompanied them before. Connecting to my inner strength and breathing light into my grief is what serves me. I'm going forward with new goals and dreams. In essence, I'm returning to the living, which allows more clarity on my purpose and my joy. I carry the loss of my son throughout the rest of my days, no doubt. Sorrow and tears are an expression of the everlasting love I have for my sweet boy. With an ongoing sense of Forrest's presence, grief is lessening its hard, fast grip. I have more room to breathe and do the work I am meant to do. As life continues unfolding, Forrest is with me every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. You know, I often try and name and address the impact and role that stigma plays in so many mental health related topics. So, Colin, I'm wondering if there were ways you and your wife felt impacted by stigma around the death of your two teenage children, Ruby and Hart, and can you describe in what ways?
I think sometimes we would have the sense that, and this could be us projecting, I don't know, but we talked about, I remember in early grief, the feeling that maybe people were going to were avoiding us because it was like a plague they could catch. Like if they spent time with us, maybe their kid would die. It's sort of like a superstitious kind of feeling. And if people had newborn babies, maybe they would just avoid us because, again, like the curse. But in terms of stigma, what I really felt stigma was related to friends of mine who had lost children to suicide and accidental drug overdose. I feel like those people, the stigma felt much more potent, so I joined compassionate friends groups, 2 compassionate friends groups, and so that in those circles, I heard a lot of stories of people who lost children to accidental drug overdoses and to suicide, and saw those parents struggling. Yeah.
So not that anyone would choose this kind of devastating loss, but still, sometimes there are things that we come to appreciate about how we've been changed by these kinds of terribly difficult experiences. And I'm wondering if there's any ways that you have been changed or shaped by this that you now value or appreciate about yourself.
Yeah, I feel like because I live with this pain on a daily basis, I have a lot more compassion and empathy and understanding for other people in pain. I feel like, I see you, I get you. Grief is grief, and people in emotional pain are in emotional pain, and so that I think that I'm more understanding of other people's experiences out in the world, and so I feel, enriched in that sense.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today, we're revisiting a remixed conversation discussing the many challenges related to the intense grief parents experience after losing a child. We're also talking about how parents can find their way through the darkest of times and into living their lives again. With us for this conversation is father, writer, and director Colin Campbell, whose 2 teenage children, Ruby and Hart, were killed in a car crash by a drunk driver. We're also joined by psychotherapist, grief specialist, and writer Kara Bowman. Every State of Mind episode includes a list of helpful resources. The resources we discussed today, along with additional information about support, are available in the show notes for this episode. You can also listen or subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms or on your home smart speaker. All episode notes, resources, and subscription information can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Let's get back to our interview. Colin, I understand that you've also opened your home and hearts to foster children. What contributed to you making that choice, and how is that going?
Oh, thanks for asking. Initially it was Ruby's idea, believe it or not. A few years before she was killed, she said to Gail and I, we should foster adopt. And we were like, what? She's like, yeah, there are kids out there that need a loving home, and we have a loving home. And it seems so beautiful. She was such a sweet kid. And so we felt like after Ruby and Hart were killed, that we still wanted to be parents. That was such a central, integral part of our identity, because Ruby and Hart were both living at home. Ruby was 17, Hart was 14. They were in high school and middle school, and so being a parent was a very active, daily part of our lives. And we loved having teens. We loved just talking to teenagers. And so about a week after the crash, I said to Gail, we could still be parents. And she said, oh, thank you for saying that, because she was thinking the same thought, but was scared that I wouldn't want to, that it would be too terrible to risk loss again. It seems so scary suddenly to be a parent. And so we're currently fostering to adopt two, a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old. I call them teenagers, but she's only 12, our daughter. But and it's a very complicated emotionally. It's not an easy path, because they have had a lifetime of trauma, and so they have very naturally developed not an aversion to attachment, but attachment issues are real. But I think it's going well. I think they're great kids. And I think we have great times together, and then we also have great struggles together.
As is all parenting. Right.
Yeah. Parenting, when you're parenting it, especially a teenager, you're putting down a lot of rules. And if they've grown up with you since birth, you have a whole well of natural affection and memories to draw on. But having teenagers into your house suddenly, initially as strangers, now they're not strangers, they've been with us for 6 months now, but that's not that long, 6 months. It's sort of tricky, right? Putting out all these rules, because they can say, you're not my parent, but they've never said that, but I'm sure they're thinking that though. But at the same time, it's also beautiful. And it feels like a real privilege. It feels like a real privilege to have kids in my home. And I have to say that it means a lot to me. Yeah.
Kara, can you talk some about what you've seen as just a few of the unexpected outcomes of a devastating loss like that of a child? What can they be?
When you're in this very, very stressful situation, you've only got two choices, up or down, and you can choose up. So any trauma or loss can cause you to reevaluate your life, and it can cause you to bring what's most important to you to the surface. I had a client whose daughter died, and she got over a lifetime of anxiety. She just said none of her worries seemed important anymore, and she was able to let go of all of them. And she had been medicated and gone through every kinds of therapy before that. And all of a sudden, with one loss, she realized that none of that mattered. I had a client whose 4-year-old son died, and she was able to really live in the moment and really take in the beauty of every moment. She had a living daughter, and she was able to be very, very present with her. And she really appreciated that and had a lot of gratitude. So people can have a new career, a new meaning to their life. They can use grief to heal longstanding trauma. They can honor the child's life by creating something, or even taking something of the child within themselves. I've heard of people saying, my child had this personality characteristic, and I want to honor them by being more like that. And they can change longstanding patterns, such as changing self-judgment to self-compassion. And so there's all kinds of growth that can come out of loss.
Thank you. Colin, are there resources that you'd want to share with listeners that have been particularly helpful to you as you've been navigating the loss of your 2 teenage children?
Yeah. A book that I found particularly helpful very early on in my grief was Bearing the Unbearable by Dr. Joanne Cacciatore. And that book really sort of sets it out very clearly, the importance of actively grieving. I actually bought copies and sent them to my entire family because I wanted them to know that I was going to actively grieve. I wasn't going to avoid my grief. And so that was sort of helpful for me to think about for myself, and then also to announce to my family. And so that helped me.
And Kara, are there a couple of resources that you have found to be helpful for parents who've lost a child, or perhaps for friends and family members who want to support them?
Sure. One I really like is grieving.com. It's an online support forum, and it has a room for loss of child. You can either write or you can just read what others have written. And one thing that's nice about it is it's available 24/7. And also Compassionate Friends has a magazine that's available by free online subscription called We Need Not Walk Alone.
Well, Kara, what do you see as a few of the most important first steps for a parent who may just have recently lost a child?
Oh, gosh. I guess ask constantly, what do I need right now? So self-connection, and then gathering social support and asking for what you need. It's a new skill for a lot of people, but it's a time to use it. And then asking what it would mean to honor your child's life. Mm-hmm.
Colin, what last few things would you want to share with our listeners? This might be something you wish you had understood earlier in your own grieving process, or perhaps something that you've learned since you went through it yourself.
Yeah, I think they're very similar to Kara's, but I'd say don't grieve alone. And find ways of keeping your current community and or finding a new community that you can share your grief with. And then 2, ask for what you need. And first you have to figure out what you need, because it's not so clear what we need in grief, but thinking about what you need and then asking for it. And then 3rd, I'd say don't be afraid of the pain. It's very terrifying there's a feeling, if I start to weep, I'll never stop, because Ruby and Hart are dead forever. So why would I ever stop weeping? And it's so scary, and I might weep until I lose my mind, but that's not actually what happens. Nobody weeps forever. But even though it feels like you might. So I'd say don't be afraid of the pain of grief.
Well, that concludes the interview portion of our program. We'll now hear from another parent, Tim, about the devastating grief of losing his son, Ben, to suicide, how it changed him, and how that is changing with time. Michael Stark is the reader for Tim's story.
The saddest piece of music I've ever heard is Goretzky's Third Symphony. I turned to it to deal with the most significant loss of my life, the death of my 23-and-a-half-year-old son, Ben. He took his life February 12, 2012. As gutted as my wife and I were upon hearing this news, as profound as the shock that engulfed us going forward, neither of us were surprised. We'd watched Ben grow this suicide for a decade. Brilliant, multi-talented as he was, Ben couldn't cope in the real world. He became another poster child for the failure to launch series. At his memorial, many friends reassured us that we'd done everything possible for him. Multi-courses of medication and different therapists never yielded anything but short-lived relief. Any parent walking this path, having a dead child, will be bombarded with every version of, I can't imagine, fill in the blank. I realized quickly I wanted a better response to those benevolent words than awkwardly saying thank you, hoping for the moment to pass. It took me a couple of days, but I came up with it. When someone would approach me with the telltale aura and begin, I'd cut them off, touching their shoulder, and say, you're right, you can't imagine. Be grateful you can't. Some losses are beyond words. Sublime poetry doesn't touch this grief, only music. My son's death cured me of many things. My straight male inhibition to show tears was obliterated. I was 62 when he died. I've never been a death denier, but after Ben's death, I came to fully realize and live with the conscious awareness that death sits on my shoulder. It's not over the next ridge, nor around the next bend in the trail. It's not morbid, it simply is. Of the myriad forms of crying, full-body grieving causes every part of your body to hurt. You shed tears, snot runs down your nose, no words, no tender touches can reach this grief. You want to die. You wonder if you can go on. Most can, some can't. My first hospice counselor gave me a term I'd not heard before. Struggling to find my words, he interjected, "You mean grief quake?" The perfect phrase. Grief quakes were frequent in the first months following Ben's death, and episodically for years. They were surreal, could occur with an obvious trigger, hearing a favorite song of his, or with no trigger whatsoever. Several times while walking, a grief quake would take my legs out. I couldn't stand or walk. More than once I had to grab onto a signpost or a tree to remain upright. This grief erases time. It takes you over 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. I don't know. But eventually it passed, and I could walk home. The crying that accompanied these episodes came from the depths of my being. I was not in control. Listening to Goretzky's Third accesses that level of grief. Every now and then, my intuition tells me it's time for another session with Heinrich Goretzky. I always comply. Last time, on headphones, a new dimension of my sorrow emerged. For the first time, I was grateful for my pain. This blessed grief I carry of my son, I've learned to live with. And I can't live without it.
Thank you, Tim and Michael. In closing, I want to share a quote that I came across in preparing for the show. This was said by a mom in Michigan named Mindy Wolven of Lake Orion, who lost her 16-year-old son to suicide. You're not getting over your child by allowing yourself to be happy again, Mindy says. Grief is like a weight. When you first pick it up, it's heavy and hard. While the weight never changes, your muscles get stronger. You learn new ways to carry it. You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I want to say a huge thank you to our guests, Colin Campbell and Kara Bowman, to our In Your Voice contributors, Christy and Tim, and to the reader of Tim's story, Michael Stark. And thanks to you for joining us. I do encourage listeners to check out the books written by our guests, Finding the Words, Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose by Colin Campbell, and Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss by Kara Bowman. Both are listed in our resource list in the show notes for this episode. If you found today's show meaningful, you may also want to check out episode 80, Suicide Loss, Living with the Pain and Learning to Heal, episode 86, Writing to Heal, and episode 73, Difficult Mothering of Adult Children Through Mental Illness and Addiction. New episodes of State of Mind come out the first Sunday of every month, and you can find our full archive at stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of today's conversation or you want to share it with someone, subscribe to the State of Mind podcast on any of the major platforms. And if this episode spoke to you, could you please take a moment to rate and review the show? Your feedback helps others find these conversations and the support they need. We want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. Share your story by submitting an In Your Voice recording. Call in or record a short clip right on your phone about a mental health experience, recovery insight, or a resource that's helped you. Your story may just be featured in a future episode. Submission details are available at stateofmindmedia.org. Special thanks to our State of Mind team. Yusuf Hassanein for audio production and marketing direction, Vijay Luca for audio production, Evelyn Campbell for community coordination, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Tanmai Kadamani for transcriptions, Priscilla Yee and Grishma Jain for graphic design, Nimilan Elenchoven for marketing, Austin Gautreaux for media content creation, and Melanie Dominguez and Sarah Eisenberg for research. And thanks to musician Adrian Legg and Favored Nations Entertainment for our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. Join us again next month for another episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.